the Klingons didn't clean their Klingons off the starboard bow there. So Alex Rawlings has been reduced to cleaning Klingons off the starboard bow. That's not very nice. Certainly not what I had in mind for him.
So, I spent about 3 hours this morning making this very nice PowerPoint presentation for you all, then to be told that there's no projector. So, this is how it's going to work. Please be patient. I'll try and use the board if there's any space left after my drawing. And we'll try and get through it. So, Afrikaans. Basically what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the history of Afrikaans, talk a little bit about some grammar structures, things like that, basic introduction basically to everything you might want to know before you decide to learn a language like Afrikaans. But eers gaan ek 'n vraag stel, is daar iemand hier wat uit Suid-Afrika kom of Afrikaans praat? Nobody from South Africa speaks Afrikaans. Now, surprise. Yeah. I was looking at Judith's map and I was like, Congo, no. En hoeveel mense is daar hier wat Nederlands praat en dink dat hulle Afrikaans kan verstaan of perfect praat?
Nee.
Okay.
Niet perfect.
Die D is daar. Dank je. My chance. I was about to do this for an
Now, Chuck Smith, who just came in, by the way, he's the founder of Wikipedia in Esperanto.
Okay. Cool. So Afrikaans. Basically, this whole talk is going to start very basic, and then we'll maybe go a little bit more advanced. So, has anyone in this room ever looked at Afrikaans at all? In any? Cool. Did anyone get far with it? Like a little bit. In all honesty, if you know a Germanic language, this language will probably take you about 3 or 4 weeks to properly get through all the grammar, and then you can concentrate on the vocabulary, the way they speak, and that's where the really difficult stuff actually starts with Afrikaans, which is, you know, how it's actually used. And the problem is also with Afrikaans that no one actually knows how it's used, because it's a language which is evolving so fast, and a language which for the whole of the last century, sorry? It's okay, I'll hold it. A language which for the whole of the last century has been kind of distracted by political stuff from a racist white South African government that basically wanted to make it seem like it was an extremely European language, whereas in actual fact, traditionally Afrikaans has been spoken by a wide range of people in South Africa. Only 40% of native Afrikaans speakers are white. The remainder are sort of what in South Africa is called coloured, which is its own kind of identity made up of a mix of various ethnicities, which also speak this first language as well. But let's start, and this is the first question. Wat is Afrikaans? Afrikaans is a Germanic language. It's extremely close to Dutch, but also has some things which are more common with German, as you might notice. It has 7.2 million native speakers in South Africa and in Namibia. So can anybody see? There are also 15 to 23 million people who speak it as a second language in Southern Africa, which makes it actually one of the most commonly spoken languages in South Africa after English. It is currently one of 11 official languages in South Africa, although in a country where you have 11 official languages, English tends to win, unfortunately. So you don't come across it that often, but you do see it in street signs telling you to beware of children, like this one, and various others that we'll come across. Afrikaans, as well as having kind of Dutch origins, also has a lot of loan words from African languages, such as Zulu, Xhosa, Sutu, and also Malay and Indonesian as a result of South Africa's history of bringing a large number of sort of Malay slaves over to settle in the Western Cape and that kind of thing, which is kind of where the language came from. Which is the next question. Hoe het Afrikaans ontstaan? How did Afrikaans come about? So basically this is sort of a brief timeline of what happened to make Afrikaans a language. So in 1652, the Dutch colonized the Western Cape, which is this part here, the very bottom southwest of South Africa, which is where Cape Town is, which is known as the Mother City. This existed as a kind of Dutch trading post for a long time for Dutch ships going between the Netherlands and the East Indies. So there was quite a large Dutch population there, also mixed in with the slaves that they were bringing in, and of course they needed to speak to the slaves who didn't really speak proper Dutch. So this kind of jargon emerged where they kind of left a lot of Dutch grammar and basically just kind of got to the bare basics, as we'll see later. Okay, then in 1795, I mean, people are still speaking a language that they're calling Dutch, but the first poem to have been found was written in Afrikaans, sorry, which is to do with the wars that were going on at that time. And people decided that this language was very different from Dutch. This language was actually the language that was emerging in the Western Cape as the vernacular of the people there, which they called Afrikaans, or in Dutch, Afrikaans, which means African, for those of you that don't study Dutch. Then in the 1830s, we actually have the first series of kind of quite comprehensive texts published in Afrikaans, which are published with the Arabic script. So the first people to really start writing in Afrikaans are not the Afrikaners, they are the slaves. They're the people who first of all started translating the Quran, they started translating all of the religious texts, and they started using the Arabic script. So it's a similar kind of situation to what you have going on with Yiddish, actually, and minority languages like that that are based on religious groups, where they start writing down their own way of speaking, and of course using the Hebrew alphabet. In South Africa we have a similar thing, where people write what is known as Arabisch Afrikaans, using the Arabic script. Now in 1836 we have the start of what is called the Groot Trekke, or the Great Treks, which happens when the British get involved, those great people. The British decide South Africa is this wonderful country with lots of resources, you know, it's a brilliant location, so we want it. And the Afrikaners weren't particularly happy about this because they had a degree of autonomy, they had a degree of independence, and they didn't basically want to become another part of the British Empire, another America, if you like. So they left. They left this little corner of South Africa that they lived in, and they went sort of in three main directions. Okay? The first one, as you will see, is up here towards the northeast, towards Johannesburg nowadays, and this big gold area. The second direction went more along the coast to this area called Durban nowadays, and settled there in traditional Zulu territory. Whereas the final one went north into Namibia, and still today there's about 10% of the population that's Afrikaans speaking, although this is ever decreasing as those speakers seem to be moving back to South Africa. So this had an enormous impact on the language as well, because it meant that Afrikaans suddenly had a whole different range of influences on it that weren't just the traditional kind of English and Dutch, because there was all this contact suddenly with other linguistic groups, and particularly the Zulus who've had a big influence, and also because the area in which the language was spoken changed as well, which meant that certain aspects would be more affected as it becomes kind of like an inland language with mountains and this kind of thing rather than a sea language. Anyway, so this culminates, of course, in the 1850s, where you have two separate Afrikaans-speaking republics established in these areas. So, sorry. You have the South African Republic, which is around the area of what is today Gauteng, so Johannesburg, Pretoria, that kind of real gold area. And you also have the Oranje Vrystaat, or the Orange Free State, which is centered around Bloemfontein. England lost a football match there in the World Cup. Right in the middle, against Germany, I think. And these since have also become large areas, even today, of Afrikaans speakers in South Africa, in addition to the Western Cape, in addition to Cape Town. In 1875, you have this society established called the Genootskap van Regte Afrikaners. So, like the community, the brotherhood of right Afrikaners. And I think it's deliberately quite ambiguous as to what it means, but of course, in the next century, that turns into something quite ugly. These were the people who decided that Afrikaans definitely was a different language to Dutch, that Afrikaans culture was completely different to Dutch, and therefore that should be established as such. and that they should sever ties as much as possible from the Netherlands and establish South Africa as this Afrikaans place. Now, at the end of the 19th century, 1899 to 1902, you have the Boer War, as we call it in Britain, or the South African War, as they call it in South Africa, which is when the British decide that they're going to take over these Afrikaans independence republics and basically incorporate them into the wider, now English-speaking South Africa. This is an extremely important moment for the definition of Afrikaans culture, because this is the first time where in the Afrikaners' point of view, they are about to be colonized by the British. They are suddenly, as they see it, the native white African tribe that is about to become part of the British Empire, and they're about to fight. And ever since this moment, this has kind of been a driving force in a lot of Afrikaans poetry, a lot of Afrikaans songs and stories. It's kind of been this moment of when they fought the British off. Anyway, the South Africans, well, the Afrikaners basically won. As in 1910, South Africa was set up as an independent country. They got rid of the Queen, which we haven't even done in the UK yet. And in 1924, Afrikaans was made the official language of South Africa over Dutch, as people decided finally that it would be respected as its own language. So those are kind of the big dates in how Afrikaans came about. And as you can see, 1924 is not even 100 years ago, 90 years ago in fact, this year. And that is how long Afrikaans has really existed as a language. So it is one of the world's youngest languages. And this also has problems with it. This, by the way, is an example of one of the first ever scripts written in Arabic Afrikaans. So you can see the use of Arabic script. This is apparently a poster to encourage people to vote in the local elections. Now, I know a little bit of Arabic script, but this is very difficult, so I'd love to be able to read this to you, but basically as far I can get is vote for Mr. Onsman. Don't know who he was. But there you go. Of course, after 1924, you have this whole new chapter of South African history, where in 1948, the National Party wins the general elections, and they introduce this policy of forced racial segregation, known as Apartheid, which is an Afrikaans word meaning apartness.
In which year was Apartheid introduced?
I'm sorry?
In which year was Apartheid introduced?
It was introduced gradually over about 3 years, starting in 1948, which is when the National Party won the elections. By about 1951, 1952, it's kind of fully in place. Then it kind of continues for quite a long time as things get more. They turn up the pressure. They try more greatly to kind of purify the Afrikaans nation of African influences. And then finally in 1994, you have Nelson Mandela elected. And the previous 4 years to that, you have F.W. de Klerk kind of also introducing policies to reverse apartheid and to bring it back. And that's kind of the time. But the important date for understanding the history of Afrikaans is 1974, which is the Afrikaans Medium Decree, the infamous law which stated that Afrikaans and English had to be used equally in all schools, at least equally in all schools across South Africa, with a tendency towards Afrikaans. Now this, of course, meant that it wasn't just Afrikaners and English people that were suddenly forced to use Afrikaans, but the entire country. And of course, the great number of population, about 80%, which is native African and speakers of Zulu and did not speak Afrikaans, suddenly found that they went into the classroom and their kids were being taught in Afrikaans. Now this caused absolute uprisings and horror across the entire country. And in 1976, we saw the Soweto uprising, which is seen as one of the most defining moments in apartheid history, when roughly 700 people were massacred by the South African police for protesting about the fact that they wanted the right to choose to have their children educated in their own language or in English. Okay, but also, I mean, in this time, if you consider the fact that Afrikaans only comes about as a language in 1924, this is the defining time for Afrikaans. What is it as a language? What is it as a culture? And so in this period of kind of real fascism and horrible kind of racial segregation, you have the establishment of an Afrikaans or Boer culture. They start to decide what their values are. They start to decide how they're going to sell themselves as a culture, which has implications even for today. Because for a lot of people, certainly from my parents' generation, they cannot divorce Afrikaans from racism. They cannot divorce it from apartheid, which is of course an Afrikaans word. And this is kind of a debate which happens, of course, in Germany. You know, how do we move German on from the Nazi side? How do we make sure that that doesn't have those kind of connotations anymore? But of course, as German is a much older language with a much longer tradition of history, a much longer kind of existence on the planet, that's a far easier job than for Afrikaans. which, after sort of 10, 15 years, suddenly becomes this vehicle for this fascism and for this policy of racial segregation. However, it is also important to mention that at the same time that this culture was established, there was a counterculture established. There are plenty of people and writers who are successful to today who continue to write in Afrikaans criticizing the government, criticizing the policies of apartheid, and calling for a more kind of African-based form of living in South Africa that would meant, living together. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute, but I mean, it's just important to mention that not everybody was, of course, on the side of apartheid. Afrikaans vandaag in Mora. This is about now where Afrikaans is today, after 1994. So Afrikaans is still the third most spoken language in South Africa, after Zulu and Xhosa. English comes at number 5, just to make a point. There are still to this day, well, in 2008 there were 1,767 single medium Afrikaans schools in South Africa, which means it's actually the biggest number of schools in South Africa after English, that purely teach in Afrikaans. And of course they attract a wide spectrum of people to their schools, not just people of Afrikaans origin as well. The most recent census as well said that first language speakers of Afrikaans were 40% white, 50% coloured South Africans, which is that ethnic group that I was mentioning earlier that basically descended from the Malays, from also the Khoisan, and it's this real kind of mix that basically are argued by some to be the true South Africans now. And also interestingly, 9% of Afrikaans native speakers are black Africans. So there's also some crossover. It's not an exclusively white language as a National Party's propaganda may have suggested. Now, with the arrival of another 9 official languages after 1994, Afrikaans lost a lot of the preferential treatment that it received under the apartheid regime, which means that there's now far less Afrikaans on television. You can also see on road signs and things where they've repainted it, they haven't redone the Afrikaans. The Afrikaans is left to kind of fade and the English is back. And there's some really kind of weird, angry YouTube videos you can watch about people complaining about that, if you really like Afrikaans. But despite that, in the last 5 years or so, Afrikaans has made a little bit of a comeback. And a lot of TV channels have started commissioning more airtime for Afrikaans channels. More schools are interested in reintroducing Afrikaans, and of course it's still studied and spoken by 15 to 23 million people in the country. So depending on where you are, it can be an extremely important language as well. So now we're going to talk more specifically about the language, having done a little bit of the history. So we're going to start with the uitspraak, which is of course the pronunciation. So there you go. Is that clear for everyone? Next question. No, never, ever, ever, no. We're going to do this my way, which means we're going to do it like this. Okay? Now, as this is like a classroom, because we have no projector and this wonderful thing, let's all repeat after me. Okay, let's go through every single sound in the Afrikaans language. Ah. 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 Oi. Oi. O. O. E. E. A. A. Ear. Ear. E. E. A. A. E. 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 O. O. U. U. Ui. Ui. Oi. Oi. Ua. Ua. That's this one. Oi. Oi. Au. 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 U. 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 Ui. Ui. E. 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 Cool. Does everyone want to like take a break from the other continents? Or? Right. Now, I had a little look at someone who's at this conference called, who runs the Omniglot blog. He has a little entry about Afrikaans, and I was quite interested to see that he had this, and there are a couple of things that I didn't quite agree with. So I put some of the sounds that he's listed as being Afrikaans sounds in brackets, because while you may come across them in Afrikaans, perhaps in like place names, that kind of thing, in the formal language they don't appear. So particularly here where you see the CH, which of course exists in Dutch and is the G sound, in all Afrikaans that is turned into a G for the sake of spelling, and I guess that's one of the things that they did to differentiate it from Dutch. Okay, but if we just go through them, first of all, nice and easy, B, K, K, Q doesn't count, it would be qua. S, sh, t, k. Yeah, that's right, the TJ, k. F, v, and then X and Z are in loanwords, like, for example, the Xhosa click is written with an X, so that in loanwords is done that. And the same in Zulu, the only word that you really find that in is the word Zulu. Everything else, the Dutch Z tends to be moved into an S in Afrikaans. So, whereas in Dutch you say Zay, in Afrikaans you say Sia, and things like that. Okay, wasn't that fun? Yeah. I should have got you to stand up. Okay, now we're going to look at some sample Afrikaans sentences, some Afrikaanse voorbeeldsinne, which is, repeat after me, my pen is in my hand. Does anyone want to have a guess what this means? Go on, Richard.
House out the window.
Close. My pen is in my hand. Sentence number 2. My arm is in warm water.
My arm is in warm water.
Anyone want to have a guess?
Nobody.
What would you know? Okay, look, it is a language. It's not just English with an accent. Let's have a look at the vocabulary, the kind of things that you can find, the woordeskat. So first of all, we have a lot of words from Germanic roots. This is kind of like the largest group. So we have a lot of ones that maybe if you speak Dutch or Afrikaans or Yiddish or Frisian, you'd understand. Maybe even English, like arm, sprung, which means jump, gemeenskap, community, taal, language, veroorsaak, which is actually my favorite word, I don't know why, to cause, praat, to speak, liefde is love, bukkie is a little bit, een bisschen, een beetje, which of course is pronounced bukkie, stem, which is voice or vote, uur, which is hour, and buiten, which is outside.
But you say bookie is small. So
Bukkie, so that's it. Yeah, een beetje in Dutch, and bisschen in German, and then we have bukkie here, bissel in Yiddish. Then we also have some other interesting sources, such as, for example, Portuguese. Because apparently a lot of Portuguese sailors used to sail through the Western Cape on their way to places, and of course the communication produced these two words, kraal and mili, which are now so lodged as a part of the language that most people don't even realize that they're from Portuguese. Now, I don't speak Portuguese, so I can't exactly remember which ones they come from there. But kraal is like an enclosure where you keep animals. I think it was something like corral, something like corral. Yeah. Awesome. And mili means flower in Afrikaans. And I do remember this one in Portuguese was milho. Someone know that?
Yes.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay.
But milho has nothing to do with flour.
What does it mean in
Milho is corn.
Maybe it means corn. I think milho means corn. What's the difference?
cornflower.
There we go. Cornflower. Mili. But then we also have words from Malay. And this is kind of the influence of the Malay slaves that were brought over to kind of work on the plantations in the Western Cape. So for example, pisang, does anyone speak any Malay here?
Pisang, banana.
Absolutely. You have a point. Baie. This is a word you hear all the time in Afrikaans, and it has completely replaced the Dutch word veel. This is how you say a lot. Baie, baie dankie, oh baie hier, oh baie Afrikaans, baie goed, baie lekker. All the time. That's probably one of the most common words you'll ever hear. Baie. Is that? Sorry?
What does it mean?
What does it mean?
It means a lot. Veel in Dutch, but Afrikaans baie. But then you also have this word here, which is spelled B-A-A-D-J-I-E and pronounced baiki. This means a coat, and this has replaced the Dutch word jas, meaning jacket, and this as well comes from a Malay root.
Yeah.
I don't speak Malay, so I don't know which one it is, but I know baiki. Then we also have a selection of words from Khoisan, which is the original language spoken in the Western Cape before either the white settlers or the Bantu people came from the north, although this language has pretty much died out now, which is very sad. But some words persist, and most importantly you have the word khocha in Afrikaans. which in Khoisan is currently from the word khocho, which means, that's good, go for it. Which means insect. Try it. Great. You also have the word in Afrikaans, assegaai, is from the Khoisan, which means spear. Karos as well is a kind of cape that you wear made out of animal hides, which as well is a Khoisan word.
That's from Nama.
Sorry?
That's from Nama, because it ends in S.
Oh, possibly, yeah.
Nama, yeah. I mean, that's of course.
Yeah, Nama is close, right? They were all kind of in that area.
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a Khoisan language.
Yeah, okay, cool. And dacha, which is also a common word, which means marijuana, comes from Khoisan. Finally, you have a couple of words as well that come from Bantu languages, in particular Zulu. So you have chana, for example, which means friends. And this is actually an example of where you see the CH and it's pronounced ch, like it would be in English, but it's because it's a foreign word. So chana. Fundi, this is a really good word for this room. This comes from a Zulu word meaning to be an expert in something. So if you want to be a language expert, in Afrikaans, you're a taal fundi. Finally, you have the word chaila, which comes from Zulu and means home. And this is more commonly seen in the Afrikaans word chaila tyd, which means time to go home. The school is chaila tyd, and everyone goes home. So that's a good example of what it comes from. Okay. Then we're into Afrikaans grammar. Now, this is why everyone hates the grammar. Oh no, cry. Don't worry, it's Afrikaans. Everything's fine. No gender. It's all die. Everything is die. Die man, die vrou, die kinder, die pisan, die sandsak, die tyd, die regering, die oorsaak. And then of course you have the indefinite article, which is just which is like a contracted version of the Dutch n, as it's also pronounced, right? So you have 'n appel, 'n dag, 'n droom, 'n land. Sorted. Next easy point. There are only 3 tenses and none of them decline. Just only 3. Okay? We have present, past, and future. So we have, for example, the verb to make. Ek maak, jy maak, hy maak, ons maak, julle maak, hulle maak. Past tense. Ek het gemaak, jy het gemaak, hy het gemaak, ons het gemaak, julle het gemaak, hulle het gemaak. The future tense. Ek sal maak, jy sal maak. The only other one that you would also do is the conditional, which, as in Dutch, is with so. So you say ek sou maak, jy sou maak, hy sou maak. It's literally as easy as it is. There is nothing more to it. Finally, almost no irregular verbs. Thank you, Esperanto. The only 2 ones that we have are to be and to have. These are the only 2 verbs that change slightly, but even then it's not that scary. And if you know Dutch, it will be pretty obvious, actually. So for example, in the past tense, to be is ek het gewees. And in the future, ek sal wees. And the infinitive is wees, even though the actual word that you use for all of them is this, ek is, jy is, hy is, ons is, etc. The other one is het, which is to have, and the only irregularity about that is that the infinitive used is hair, so ek sal hair, and the past tense is ek het gehad. That's it. Everything else is just you put ge on the front, or if there's already a prefix, like ver or ont, like who is Afrikaans ontstaan, it just stays. So there we go. Afrikaans syntax. Now, this is very interesting for me as someone who studied both German and Dutch, because I think that Afrikaans syntax is in between. Now, I am not someone that likes linguistics very much, as you may have already guessed. So I'm not going to tell you, verb phrases and prepositional phrases and X-bar theory, no. The way I think the best way to deal with this is if we just look at some sample sentences, and then we'll see what we can make of them. So the first one, iemand het my kar gesteel. Wat is die nommer van die versekeringsmaatskappy? Somebody stole my car. What's the number for the phone insurance company? Okay, so this is a very simple sentence. As you can see, iemand het my car gesteel. Germanic language, the infinitive goes to the back. You use het, auxiliary verb, and the object goes in the middle. Nothing unusual there. And wat is die nommer van die versekeringsmaatskappy? That's pretty much word for word English. What is the number of the insurance company? So we're fine. The second one. My seun werk in Londen. Hy het 'n baie mooi vrou en elke week stuur hy vir my foto's van hulle 2 klein kindertjies. My son works in London. He has a very beautiful wife, and every week he sends me pictures of their 2 little children. So what's interesting here is that you have hy stuur vir my. with Afrikaans, you'd have to kind of use vir to mean to. That's kind of how you express the dative, which in German is its own tense, and I think Dutch does this more complicatedly. And the verb vir literally means for. So you say, he sends for me. And you also say, if you want to say, like, I'm looking at the sky, you say, ek kyk vir die hemel. So this is a very useful word, and I think it's something that makes it slightly different to the other Afrikaans language, to other Germanic languages. Next sentence. Hierdie naweek het ek soveel Nando's geëet, nou vind ek dit baie moeilik om na die yskas toe te loop. This week I ate so much Nando's that I'm finding it really hard to walk to the fridge. So, again we're seeing this Germanic thing of hierdie naweek het ek. Diese Wochenende habe ich, etc. And again this. Nou vind ek dit baie... Right, this is the interesting point with this one. The direction in Afrikaans, you repeat yourself. But I'm not entirely sure whether this is a rule, because I've heard people do this and I've heard people not do this, and because, as I said earlier, Afrikaans is still an evolving language, there isn't really a definite rule about how you do this. So you can just say na, like in Dutch, you say ek gaan na Johannesburg. But some people would say ek gaan na Johannesburg toe. And some people would just say ek gaan Johannesburg toe. Now I asked native speakers and they didn't really give me a satisfactory answer. They just said, oh, you have to feel it, man. So I just praat and wait for someone to correct me. And so far, I mean, it's been okay. So I think it's pretty flexible. The second one, straightforward one. Excuse toch. Weet jy of daar 'n winkel hier rond is waar ek pampoene kan koop? Excuse me, do you know if there's a shop around here where I can buy pumpkins? Again, we have the questions, which are kind of like, they're not the main question, is do you know whether, weet jy of, wissen Sie ob, which sends the verb to the end. But here you have, like in Dutch, and unlike in German, waar ek kan pampoene kan koop. Whereas in German you say, wo ich es kaufen kann, right? And in Dutch you say, kan kopen. Now this rule doesn't last for the whole of Afrikaans, because I know also in Dutch you'd say, die ik heb gezien, right? You wouldn't say die ik gezien heb. But in Afrikaans you would. You say, wat ek gezien het. So this is where it kind of crosses both languages, and I think this arises from the fact that when Dutch was kind of put on a ship and sent to Africa in the mid-18th century, it was like not the current language which is spoken in Holland now. Some people say it's actually much more closer to Flemish than it is to the standard Dutch variety, but I mean, I'm not too familiar with Flemish, so I can't comment on that. But that's one of the examples of some of the archaicisms for Dutch ears that are found in Afrikaans. And finally, ek sal hom probeer oorreed, maar hy sal nooit weer by sy oupa gaan kuier nie. This is a negative sentence. Now Dutch people love this, they find it so funny. In Afrikaans, if you want to say you don't want to do something, you say it twice. So you say, hy sal nooit weer by sy oupa gaan kuier nie. Nie always goes at the end. So, ek praat nie Afrikaans nie. Ek kom nie uit London nie. There isn't much of a rule as well. I think when you have particular phrases, you stick the other one in. Also, no one really knows where this is from. Why did Dutch people suddenly start saying not twice? It doesn't make any sense. But one thing that some people have suggested is that there was this large wave of immigration from France, from the Huguenots, who of course do have a double negative, ne pas. And when these people started speaking what was going to become the Afrikaans language, they maybe stuck it in. So instead of just saying, ik spreek niet Afrikaans, ik spreek geen Afrikaans, they say, ek praat geen Afrikaans nie. It's good fun though. I mean, like, you never know when the next knee's coming. Like, how long is the sentence? So there we go. Are there any questions about syntax at this point before we move on? Anything?
Maybe worth mentioning that genitive, the Mariusation thing, you know, like.
Oh, right, of course. But this exists in Dutch as well, doesn't it?
Does it?
Something like this. Mariusation, like you can write that.
Yeah.
Or something. There's a zin with the thing. Basically, like in Afrikaans, if you want to say Maria's daughter, you say Maria, se, dochter, for example. And it's just the se which covers this, which carries this possession. You can also say die dochter van Maria as well, if you would, but that's something that exists. Afrikaans populaire cultuur. Now, this is basically the final slide today. This is about kind of Afrikaans in popular culture, where it occupies, where it is. You may have seen these two great characters. These are South Africa's most successful export rather, at the moment, called Die Antwoord. who are kind of like a crazy rave band, no one can really define them, from South Africa, you never wear any clothes, and they sing crazy songs with a lot of expletives which you have not given me permission to play to you today. They're extremely popular at the moment. They have this really interesting thing though as well, that even though there's a lot of expletives, but Afrikaans is a great language to swear in, they sing simultaneously in English and Afrikaans. And they find rhymes between English and Afrikaans that work extremely well and that completely represent the way people speak in colloquial Afrikaans today in areas of Cape Town. I find it really awesome to listen to, and I also really like the music. They've now got 3 albums, one's just come out. The Antwoord, The Answer, check them out. You also have this other band, Fokof Politika. Now these were like the first people to come along to start singing in Afrikaans that weren't kind of like churchgoers. And the band name means of police car. When they came out, everyone was like, oh, it's over, man. Afrikaans culture, it's done. This is what we are now. And then, of course, the Antwoord came along and they had to eat their words. Making Fokof Politika look like a church group. So this is kind of like the music side of things. Now, you also have a lot of Afrikaans authors as well, who are actually really good. One of the most famous of them is J.M. Coetzee, who was very active during the Apartheid years, writing a lot of really interesting books. But he also continued afterwards. He continued after 1994, writing about what South Africa is today. And also criticising it a lot, criticising the current government and criticising the direction that it's taking. Now, this is also not just J.M. Coetzee. One person who I've also forgot to mention is Andre Brink, who's one of my favourite authors in the world. And Andre Brink writes every novel he writes first in Afrikaans and then sits and translates it personally into English. So you can read either version, but obviously you want to read both, because polyglots and stuff. But he also has this really interesting perspective. And unlike J.M. Coetzee, he has not left South Africa yet. J.M. Coetzee now lives in Australia as part of the expatriate community. So when Andre Brink writes about what's going on in South Africa now, it's really from like the front line, basically. And he's talking about kind of like a new form of racial policy, a new form of kind of like positive discrimination, which of course is part of the law in South Africa. It's very much from someone who's there and living it. And also from somebody who was very critical and vocal of the apartheid years, which gives it this whole interesting perspective as well of, how great is the new South Africa, really. Then, of course, we have a number of films which have featured South Africa and somehow featured Afrikaans. Now, Blood Diamond I've put in brackets because I can't not mention it, but it's absolutely awful. And Leonardo DiCaprio's South African accent is awful, and the Afrikaans he speaks brutal at night. But it's there. You also have Invictus, which is the film about that moment in when South Africa, after the end of apartheid, won the Rugby World Cup. And there was this wonderful kind of like Nelson Mandela coming onto the pitch, and everyone was like, oh, it's the future, it's great. It's a really good film, and it features Afrikaans as well. And also District 9, that film about the aliens and the prawns. If you're feeling bored, it's a good thing to do on a Tuesday night. So there you go. This is basically the whole thing. Here is a list of other materials that you can use if you want to check out more about Afrikaans. The book that I used to teach myself was Teach Yourself Afrikaans. And because Afrikaans is a very simple language grammatically, by the final chapters it's actually very advanced. And that book kind of proposes to get you up to more like a C1 level if you really stick with it and doing, whereas the other ones maybe A to B1, B2. So that's really good. I also think the colloquial book is quite good, but I haven't looked at it personally. There are also a number of websites. EasyAfrikaans.com is a free website where you can check out grammar, you can do exercises, and you can read about all that kind of thing. Openlanguages.net/Afrikaans is the original website that an Afrikaans linguistic professor in America set up, which has an awful lot of interesting exercises as well, and like really interesting cultural background. That's kind of what really got me into Afrikaans before I decided to buy the book. And also you can try and watch South African TV. I think it depends very much on where you are, but Kijknet and SABC are the two main South African TV providers. SABC has about 4 channels in 11 languages, one of which is Afrikaans, so just make sure you've got your timings right. And finally, there's a number of Afrikaans newspapers that also print online, the biggest of which is the Beeld newspaper, which is www.beeld.com. Okay, I'm going to give my arm a rest now. Thank you very much for watching, and if you've got questions, I'd love to hear them.